Passion and purpose don't have to be the same thing. For example, I would say that my passion comes from creativity, meeting people, bridging connections, but I think my purpose comes from a deeper sense of community and impact.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, my name is Diptii Shah and welcome to my show Artistry. Today I have with me an international pop star, Aditi Nagral. Hello Avanti and welcome to my show.
Hi, Diptii. Namaste. Thank you so much for having me and for the very kind introduction.
Thank you so much, Avanti. My pleasure. I feel so old, I can't tell you in front of you. Avanti, you have become an international musician at such a young age. How did this journey begin? Please tell us.
I mean the journey to kind of everything that I'm doing right now, I think, you know how there's so many things that you do in life and you don't know how the paths connect. I feel very grateful that that's kind of the journey, the manifestation that it's taken. I knew from a very young age, I tried to understand that in life, in my opinion, there's two things that guide you very strongly. One is a sense of passion, and the other is a sense of purpose. I think I realized very quickly because I've spent half my life between the US and India. I've moved around a lot. I've, had different life experiences. I've had, whether that's, I've had a lot of personal health issues, a lot of different things that have shaped my worldview. And I think I was very hyper aware of inequity at a very young age, right? Inequity in health, inequity in education, moving from white picket fence suburban Massachusetts to Bombay, you immediately get thrown into paradox, right? And so I was hyper aware of that. And I think that what that did was keep me constantly curious and questioning and realize that whatever it is, if you want to have some sort of impact in this world, you have to find your own unique way to do that. And for me, all that I knew from a very young age was that whatever that was, I wanted it to be able to use my voice, whatever that meant. Because music was always a passion for me. It's been in my blood since I was born. I've done, many, many different things musically. I didn't necessarily think it would become a profession, and nor did I think that this digital, social media world would also become a profession. That was a more quite recent, past couple of years situation. But it happened because of the pandemic. It happened because of all of these things. So I think, to answer your question in an abridged version, I think it just came from this desire to find my own voice, but also figure out ways to use it in multiple different ways. Because I truly believe that we should not chase a job, right? Often we are conditioned to grow up, go to school, go to college, get a job, get married, have kids, and die. As not to sound morbid, but there's all of these expectations we have of ourselves in this kind of template. But I think that each one of those things is a choice in how you approach them. And for me, what I really was hopeful for is how do you find a way to chase a life you want to live, and therefore everything else falls into place, right? As opposed to chasing a specific job. What are the principles of the life you want to live, and then everything else happens.
I'll go deeper into this, Avanti. Finding your passion and then making it your purpose in life is kind of the wisdom that is viral right now. If I may quote Jay Shetty on this, find your purpose, find your passion. What has been your support system, and how did you achieve this clarity early in life? Because many of the people, I would say 90% of the people want to do this, find their passion, make it their purpose, but they just really have no idea how to go about it. Can you explain?
Oh, absolutely. I also think that your passion and purpose don't have to be the same thing. For example, I would say that my passion comes from creativity, meeting people, bridging connections, but I think my purpose comes from a deeper sense of community and impact, right? And it comes from this inequity that I had seen, and I'd always been passionate about the intersection between arts and media and kind of the social impact space. How did that come about? I think it's a lot of different life experiences. I have been really grateful to have a support system, as you said. My parents, my family has been pretty supportive, and I think a lot of your environment and exposure matters, right? So all my grandparents are doctors, some aunts and uncles, cousins, etc. So I grew up with that kind of family background, but my parents call themselves the black sheep. My dad is an entrepreneur in the tech space, and my mom's in the wellness world. She's a yoga therapist. And so for both of them, even though they're I don't think like when it came to what I'm doing to pursue it as a profession, it was still a long conversation. I think they were a little bit more poised to understand risk taking, right? As an entrepreneur, you understand risk. My mom has had several different jobs throughout her life. So with that exposure and support, I think that made a huge difference. Um, I do also think that it's about how and whom you surround yourself with, right? I think that in general, it's super important to surround yourself with people who are vastly different to you. And that can mean in different ways. So I think as a young child, I was surrounded by a lot of people from different backgrounds, also surrounded by different ages, right? I think when you're only surrounded by your peer group, you get stuck in that age. But I have a younger brother, so had a lot of younger, folks and a lot of older folks too. And I think my parents made it a concerted effort that we became close to their friends individually. I always sought out mentorship. My educational experiences were beautiful in that sense. So I think that that plays a huge role. And quite frankly, the purpose question, when I moved to Bombay, I went to high school in South Bombay, right? And a lot of people grew up with extreme wealth and, certain kinds of things, which were really fascinating um, to see that that was generational wealth that had been there for years, right? And I've recognized, I think very early on that you can have all the money in the world, but money can't buy you purpose. Money can buy you comfort, it can buy you luxury, it can give you the safety net or the ability to pursue something you enjoy. But if you don't have a sense of purpose, you're going to still be very, very unhappy, no matter how much money you have. Um, I also think that, because I trained in Indian classical music for a number of years, in our culture, we have these traditions, right? The Guru Shishya Parampara and things of that nature, where it's a sacred relationship that you have between a teacher and a student. And I'm so grateful that a lot of my middle and high school was in India because I think that inculcates across the board, right? And so you grow up having that deep connection with people and I think if you make that connection, then you're also surrounded by that thought leadership.
Right, absolutely right. So you had that conducive environment, and you had that privilege, of exposure to the right people, to the right circumstances, which actually shaped your thinking.
Absolutely. I mean, I became hyper aware of my privilege from a very young age, right? Even in the health sense, like I mentioned, I grew up with a lot of different uh, physical health difficulties, including I was born with a heart condition. I had a situation where I nearly lost eyesight because of a brain virus. A lot of different things that in individual moments were a little bit traumatic, and music became my healing tool, which is why it was always so close to my heart. But when all of them happened, I had access to care because of socioeconomic class and exposure, and quite literally my family being doctors. And for a lot of people, that's not the case. So I became hyper aware of that privilege, and it became this internalized sense of, purpose, if you would call it. Maybe I didn't label it at that young an age, but how do I make sure that this gap is bridged later on?
Avanti, definitely you had that kind of background, but creativity is absolutely personal, right? And at
Yeah.
what age did you become aware of your, special gift that I have it in me to become an artist?
Um, My parents would probably say when I was 6, for the simple reason that when I was young, again, super grateful for the exposure. They put me in a lot of different things. I did everything from dance to gymnastics to sports to art to music, etc. Just to be exposed to all those worlds. And apparently, when I was 6 years old, I came to them one day and very profoundly just sat them down in the living room, and I was like, I choose music, right? I don't know
Fabulous.
at the time, but I guess that's what spoke most to me. And I've grown up doing several different things, and all of them have shaped me, but music has always been the thing that's been closest to my heart. And when I say I've done everything from I've trained in Indian classical music. I went to Christian high school, so church choir. I've done like every single inter-school competition you can imagine. I've also done a lot of professional theater, so I've done a lot of Broadway style singing, just all of these different styles and ways in which to nurture that space. And I think I fell in love with the stage at a very young age. I've been, performing on stage since I was 2 or 3. And that's always felt like a place that was home and a way to connect with people. So I just knew that that's what I wanted in life at some point, whatever that meant.
Right. So once you became aware that music was the love of your life in the workspace, uh, how did you go on training yourself? I'm sure you trained as much, if not more than the talent that you have.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so many of us are talented in so many different ways, and a lot of it's
Absolutely.
about nurture, right? If we don't have that nurture, trust me, there were years when I was a preteen, maybe early teenager, where my mom would be like, "Beta riyaz karo, practice," and I'd be like, "No, go away." So I'm really glad that I had that, voice. But it's interesting. There are some folks, and I think today, with the level of exposure this current teenage generation has, professions like content creator, podcaster, artist, musician, dancer are a little bit more accessible than they were even when I was growing up, which is a completely different generation from you and anybody else older, right? So even for us, it was hard to imagine that being a profession. So all I knew is that I wanted it to be a part of my life. I didn't think that it would be. So I don't necessarily know if I was training to be an artist from a young age, but all I knew is that I was training to make sure that this creative outlet that I had was well nurtured, because it was important to me to be not unidimensional and have, multiple dimensions to myself. And I think I'd seen a lot of people around me who had that, and it made them more interesting people, but it also, stimulated different parts of your brain, if you will.
So, Avanti, you were, of course, not aware that you would one day become a musician and suddenly at the age of 6, started doing it professionally, became an athlete in your mind and your like 18 hours of training. Of course, that did not happen. But what would you say to youngsters, who are in the same stage? They're growing up, probably, taking swimming classes or cricket classes, cricket lessons, music lessons, how should they do the minimum, that one day it helps them to choose that particular passion of theirs and make it into the world?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I also think that, let's say you love swimming or cricket or music. It's not necessary that you have to become a musician or a cricketer or a swimmer. There's
Of
so many
course.
ways to be involved with that, right? And all of these, at the end of the day, are industries within themselves. And in today's world, anything can become a profession. So I think the first thing is, if it's something you care about that speaks to you, putting in the work for the baseline training, right? Because if you don't put in the work, then you won't even be able to. I think I remember the first few years of, Riyaz were very hard, and they felt very laborious. But once you cross that path and once you cross that barrier, then the world becomes your oyster, because you have baseline level, I would not say mastery, but at least foundation of a particular skill set, right? Then beyond that, it's asking yourself questions like, what exactly is it that I like about this thing, right? For example, when it came to music for me, it had been an outlet. It had been, singing was something I enjoyed, but I think I identified very early on as a performer. And here's what I mean by that, right? Today, as a professional musician, I can do several different things. I can perform on stage, I can write music, I can compose, I can, there's 10,000, I can be in the music law field, like all of these types of things. There's 10,000 things I could do. I personally identify very much with being a performer. Therefore, most of my choices today are to nurture that aspect of my craft, which is why, I started a YouTube channel, I do other social media things, because that is one way to
Reach
expand that,
out.
as opposed to reach out, as opposed to, I could have been, because I have a lot of friends in the music industry who might perform occasionally on stage, but they love writing for other artists. They love writing jingles. They love film composition, scoring, orchestration. They also make a lot of money doing that, right? It's not that either is better from a monetary perspective. It's just what speaks to you. And while I love the creation process, I love the performativity of it more. So for me, that's the reason I do what I do, if that makes sense. And I
Of
think it's just
course. Yeah.
whatever it is, right? If let's say you love cooking, if you're a young person, you love cooking. Is it because you love food? That's a very valid reason. Is it because you love what happens when you just put things together and just see the magic of it coming together? Because that's a skill that, can translate into anything, right? As a musician, for example, you have to learn how to collaborate, work with others, be in rhythm, be in tune. And those are life skills that translate into any profession you decide to have. Finding the way to find your passion, in my opinion, there's several different ways, but one is also knowing what you do not like. Because if you don't know what you don't like, then how are you ever going to find what you love.
This is
And
such
so
a valid point. Make a list of things you absolutely do not want to do. Then
exactly.
probably you have higher chances of, moving towards and closer to what you would like to do.
Absolutely. And then also our life tends to happen in patterns, right? Today I can weave together this narrative of I learned all these musical styles, music saved my life, and blah and blah and blah blah. At the time I didn't know what was going on. So what I do recommend as an exercise to especially a lot of young people who feel a little bit confused is sit down and make a list of everything that you've done till this point in your life. You might be 16, 17, 18, 20, whatever it is, anything. Like it can be you've participated in some competition, you've done whatever it is it might be, just make a list of it. And when you do that, you will start to see patterns emerge for yourself very clearly. I'll give you an example from my life, right? I used to do a lot of other things in school beyond music. I used to do Model UN, debate, other forms of public speaking, creativity, blah, 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 blah. Did I want to do those things as professions? No, but what did I like about it? I liked the same feeling as being on stage, having agency over your voice and being able to lend a voice to issues and causes and people and communities that often don't. So it's just finding whatever that core space is.
Let's go deeper into the extracurricular benefits, when you train to become someone, say a musician, the life
Yes.
skills that you gain from that training. So, what are the top three life skills you think that a person under training gets it, as a side product, as a side effect that changes his life or helps him in his life?
A few things. Number one, you get community, which is the most beautiful thing doing anything, right? You meet other people who are similarly passionate or have come from whatever way and who see the world through that lens, right? It's why people on sports teams have such a strong camaraderie and bond because you're all there for that same thing. Similarly, with music, you get that sense of community, whether that's with your teacher or other people you might be learning with, or if you have a band, you play with other musicians, it's that sense and core sense of community. The second might not seem obvious, but music is a lot about math. Because so much of it is about rhythm, so much of it is about cadence. And so you get in some sense, while it is a very creative medium, it's also a very analytical medium. And so you do get to engage both the, left side and right side of your brain in very different ways. And anybody who's done any form of music theory or whatever it might be knows that there's a lot of math that goes into it when you're counting 12/8, 6/8, 2/4, 3/4. You're like, what is my brain? You
Mm.
know, I remember from me, because my foundational training was in Indian classical vocally, but I also played the Western classical piano for many years. And the language used in both systems is very different, right? So I'd be like, this is a semiquaver, but it's also a tivra. And I'm like, how do I translate these two? And what was beautiful, I remember, is when I was in college, I used to do a few shows, in Boston, New York, etc. And the musicians or band I had at the time were from Berkeley, the Berkeley College of Music. I did a dual degree at Harvard and the Berkeley College of Music, so I had access to both communities. And at Berkeley, a lot of the musicians were global, right? So I had people from various different countries. And I remember having to sit and try to explain, if I wanted to perform, say, a Hindi song, all of this terminology in a Western lens and vice versa. And it was one of the weirdest and hardest things that I had to do in terms of my brain, right? But it was beautiful because then you truly you understand that music is a universal language. I would say the third thing is just the emotional catharsis and space that you get by doing any form of craft. It can be anything, right? But I think the third general genuine benefit is that where it becomes a space for you to express yourself, but also become lost in, and also have a tool for your emotions, right? I've always turned to it when I'm dealing with emotions. Sometimes I write, sometimes I listen, sometimes I cry to music, sometimes I dance to it, right? And it becomes one of those things that is the common binding factor.
You have a knack of converting emotions into words.
Hmm.
How do you do that, Avanti? What is your process?
My process has been different for different things. I'll give you an example. There's some songs, also just to backtrack a little bit, right? I've been a singer for many years, but I would say I've been an artist only for a few. Because to really dig deep into artistry, you have to tap into that version of yourself. You're not just singing other people's songs, you're not just on stage. You have to be your most vulnerable self and express that, right? Through writing, through whatever it might be. Um, for me, I approach it three different ways. One is I either approach it by theme. What is something I care about in the world? Or what is something that affects me and other people? And do I want to write about it? How so? So, for example, I have a song called Suntolo, which is about mental health, which was inspired by personal experience, but also during the lockdown, a lot of our community is very young. And I would see a lot of our audience having to deal with, going to school, college online in a one bedroom situation where they have 10 people staying, not getting access, just a lot of things having to deal with mental health in a way that typically a 13 or 14-year-old wouldn't have to and wouldn't have to face it. Um, or I have a song called Permission that's about consent and making consent sexy, right? I care very deeply about sexual health and education, mental health, a bunch of other spaces. And when it comes to things like consent, which are often topics that when you talk about, they feel a little bit dense or ominous, no means no, this and that, all the rules around it. I was like, but how do you make it sexy, for lack of a better word, right? Because at the end of the day, it's permission. So we call the song Permission, you know. So a lot of it is intentional, and then sometimes it's simply catharsis. I released an album recently called Quarter Life Crisis. I turned 25 recently, and it's really about the messiness of being in your 20s, and various different aspects of that, right? Some of it involves I dealt with my first major heartbreak last year, and how did that affect me, and where did it leave me? Dealing with growing up, and I am by definition no longer even a young adult, so grappling with what that means. Where of course parts of me feel adult, but parts of me feel very young, and like I don't know what's going on in the world. And then sometimes there's a song on the album called Lights, Camera, Action, which I'd written a few years ago. And I'd written it from the perspective of a performer, right? So I was inspired by a couple things. One is, Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, all its men and women merely players. That's that's a play that I read in school, and then, in college took a few classes talking about how we all perform different roles. And so as a performer, I was like, okay, let's analyze what it's like to be a performer. Let's write a song about it where you have all the spotlight, but truly sometimes all you want to do is hide. And it's something that I wrote a few years ago, but it's almost like my own song predicted my future, because over the last year or 2 years, public visibility has grown a lot for me, right? Which I'm extremely grateful for, but it comes with its fair share of nonsense and craziness and trolling, as you can imagine, and sometimes situations of paranoia, for lack of a better word. I've been in public situations where it's beautiful to meet people who recognize you, but sometimes it can also be quite scary because you're feeling like you're constantly being watched. So it's interesting, right? Where how all of these things become that form of a tool. I think everyone's process is different. For some people, the lyrics come first. Some people, the melody comes first. Some people, it's all together at once. I personally love collaborating while songwriting so that I'm able to bounce off ideas off another person, but it really depends.
Avanti, your song Suntolo is being touted as the anthem of mental health, if we may say so. So at this age, you write such songs with such depth and clarity of thought and empathy. How do you do this? What were you thinking when you wrote this?
Firstly, that's very kind, and a funny story to share. So when we release the song, when you talk about certain things, I think it's also important to be able to provide resources, right, to somebody who might be going through something similar. So we partnered with about 50 different mental health organizations in India to provide free or subsidized or accessible therapy. And it was funny because when it came time for me to find a therapist, it was very hard for me to find someone who hadn't heard of me before because of the song. Which means that we did a good job, but it was also like, okay, I need to figure this out. But no, that song in particular is very close to my heart. As most of us probably have dealt with some sort of, mental health difficulty in our lives, and particularly the pandemic was stressful for a lot of people in different ways. I, had seen what a lot of young people were going through because, whether that's through our Discord server or through our audience or just generally talking with people, and and seeing the kinds of issues they had to deal with at such a young age, it was hard and scary. And all I knew is that at our core as human beings, all we really want is for somebody to listen, right? To create spaces of safety and comfort, and to be heard and feel valued and seen free of judgment. And so, when I was writing this song, I speak Hindi, but it's not my first language and my vocabulary is not as strong. But I knew I wanted it to be in Hindi because I felt like it would connect a little bit deeper. There's just something about older languages, the lehza and the way in which certain words are, it's hard to describe. And so I knew I wanted it to be called Suntolo. And I collaborated with this Jaipur-based poet, right? And I was trying to explain to him. So when we started writing it, it was important to me that he also understood. So I had him watch a lot of different videos on resources, understanding mental health. And we could have gone one of two ways. We could have made it a song that's a little bit preachy, anthemic, literally say the word mental health, which in Hindi is mansik sehat, or whatever it might have been. But we didn't want to go that way. We just wanted to be able to represent that internal feeling and external feeling that we all feel in some capacity at some point in life. So I remember explaining to him where a lot of the feeling is like you're about to burst into tears, ऐसे लगता कि कभी ना कभी रोना आएगा, या ऐसे वातावरण में लगता है, in your environment you feel like things are hazy and it feels like there's this cloud around you. And I said all of these things, and he stopped for a second. He was like, hold on, सब कुछ रुआ सा है, धुंधला धुआं सा है. And those two lines encapsulated exactly what I was trying to say. So that's why I love collaborating with people who are able to in that particular song, I knew my area of development lay in being able to communicate that succinctly in the language. In other songs, I love collaborating with people who are amazing on the guitar because they're able to bring out a different sort of musicality, if that makes sense. But we were very, very intentional with that song, where we wanted it to be something that reached people and also made them feel a certain way. So we, of course, had a music video for it, but I also partnered with 25 different Gen Z content creators, for lack of a better word, because I knew that all of their audiences would also be going through something similar. And we used this call and response technique where the chorus is just suntolo, 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 and it becomes with tools musically like what we call a crescendo, where you're increasing the volume, the intensity, and the way in which you're singing it. But every time you say suntolo, there's some sort of societal barrier that's being said, and when you hear the song, you'll hear that as a chorus in your ears. So for example, log kya kahenge, what will people say? Muskura ke dekho, when a lot of people say, hey, I'm struggling, often the response we get is, oh, you'll be fine, just smile, be happy, right? When someone says I am struggling, the response to that is not be happy. Or when someone says I'm sad, of course, someone would try to be happy if they were capable of it, but if they are at the moment feeling a certain way, you have to let them express themselves. And what I loved is, because in my opinion, what I love about music, and part of the reason that I wanted to do it professionally, is it's a medium that connects not just with your mind, but also your heart and soul, and it has that emotional connect. And so a teenager, young adult can play that song in the background while they're talking to their parents. The parent might say, oh, nice song, nice beat, whatever. But that subliminal message is there. They might have them watch a music video, and without having to say exactly because they feel like they can't bridge that discussion because of stigma around it, they're able to represent it in a particular way, and that might open up conversation. And that's exactly what happened. We had hundreds of schools, Rotaract clubs, recreating this. We had a little, pass the paper situation on people saying suntolo when I say XYZ. And it became really powerful as something that was way beyond us, way beyond the song. And to me, when you put out something into the world, whether it's as a creative person or even when you put out a product into the world, whatever it might be, your work starts then. You've put in a lot of work to get it to where it is, but your work starts in when people engage with it. What are the conversations? How can you make sure that it's in the world in a way that you're also helping, like I said earlier, providing resources, since we partnered with different organizations. So that was the intention.
Avanti, you've become a youth icon. Is it intentional or just a byproduct of your public recognition?
That's a very interesting question. I think the initial part of it, not intentional to become a youth icon by any means, but when I started, So when I graduated from college, it was in the middle of the pandemic. At that point, I'd been doing music professionally. I'd been in the industry for a few years, releasing music while I was still going back and forth in college. But the world had shut down, and a lot of the other public speaking and community engagement that I used to do, I could no longer do in the ways that I wanted to. So then I saw YouTube being that digital means to do that and other ways. But you have to start somewhere, right? You have to, when it comes to this world, a lot of people think creativity means you sit with a paper pen, something just strikes inspiration, and you're like, la, 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 la. No, so much of it is you have to plan, you have to be analytical, you have to create space for it. And truly, I believe as an artist, you are a startup, but you also happen to be the brand and the product. So sometimes it's hard to have distance from that. And there's a very fine line between the person you are and the persona, especially if you try to be a lot of yourself. So for me, when I decided to start, I was what, 22 at the time. And I was like, who in the world am I going to relate to? Who is going to find me relatable, right? Will it be a 57-year-old man? Probably not. But will it be a slightly younger girl who might, have global experiences or might be Indian or South Asian in background? Possibly, and I knew as an older sister of a younger brother, having, met and interacted with so many people who were younger than me, that I knew how to build that bond and that camaraderie. I was like, okay, what did that mean? That just meant that I was no longer catering to anybody else. Initially, I catered to that audience. For example, in the music industry, you will get a lot of advice from a lot of people to be enigmatic and, look a certain way, dress a certain way, show off your body in a certain way. And none of those things felt like me. And sometimes business is business, right? It's called show business for a reason. But I knew that there was possibility of still being able to feel true to whom I was and build through that, right? So I didn't worry about the male gaze. I didn't worry about all of the other things that I was being given advice to worry about. I was like, I'm speaking directly to teenage girls. That's when I started out. What turned out happening is because I would, create content in addition to music around things like education, around, a lot of life skills and all of these other spaces, it ended up being a lot of both young women and men and people from all different gender backgrounds. And I realized it's because for a lot of young men, they care very deeply about issues like periods and menstruation and gender equity, but they don't have a safe space to go to explore that part of themselves or express themselves. So it was very fascinating to me to see that that was the case. And then as you grow, it just depends on, because I have grown, it's been 2.5 years since then. I have grown a lot as a human being, and people stay with you in your level of growth. Songs as an audio medium, Suntolo can connect with anyone. You can be of any age, right? You don't have to be that. That was a little bit of a long answer, but my point is that it was intentional to build community in a youth space because I knew that that's where I would have my biggest strength and serve well. But the recognition I'm really grateful for. I mean, it's not something you can plan for, and I'm so grateful for our community every day.
Avanti, last question. What are your top tips for a young person who is training to become an international musician?
Well, I'll broaden it a little bit. For a young person who's training to become whatever it is that they want to be, right? That might be a little bit off the beaten path. Number one, do not let anybody tell you that you are too young to do anything. I, at a very young age, cared very deeply about a lot of issues. I remember very particularly, I did this Model UN conference where the focus was on organ and human trafficking. I became really interested in organ donation, and I was in the US one summer. I literally called up the United Network for Organ Sharing, said, hey, I'm a 14-year-old girl who is blah, blah, blah interested. I want to speak to XYZ people. Immediately connected me. I came back to India a month later, tried doing the same thing here, and the response that I got was, "Tu bachchi hai, tu kya janti hai?" Which is, your child, what do you know? And that, of course, made me feel disheartened, but it also made me feel like I'm always going to have this in my life. Someone's always going to say, you're too young, you're of a particular gender, you're too this, you're too that. You can't let that affect you. You have to drown out that noise because at the end of the day, a baby shark is still a shark, still the potential, right? And you have to keep going. That's number one. Number two is building a support system is really, really important because nothing in this world is ever done alone. Some of us are lucky that we have families who are supportive, some of us are not. And one of the things that I learned very young is you can seek out mentorship from anybody and everybody. I have certain adults in my life whom I met through college or school, or honestly quite randomly, whom I feel comfortable going to with issues that I can't take to my parents for whatever reasons, right? Or whom are in a particular industry, because my parents, while of course they understand risk, they had no idea about this industry. So I was like, okay, let me try to befriend somebody who does and simply ask for advice. And you'd be surprised, more often than not, people love sharing their advice. They love sharing stories because they see a part of themselves in you. So as a young person, one of your biggest assets and strengths is to be able to ask for that advice and genuinely just be a sponge and take everything in. And the third thing I would say is, I'm a planner. I'm a huge planner. My Google Calendar is like filled to the T with color coded whatever. But I have learned in this industry and in life, you can plan all you want and life will be like, hello. And so I think there's a movie called The Incredibles, which I'm hoping some of you who are watching this have seen, because if not, then I feel old. But it's an animated movie, and there's a character in it called Edna. She's the stylist, and she says this thing that always stayed with me. She says, "Darling, luck favors the prepared." And I didn't understand it at the time, but it's really stayed with me. And what I love about that is so much of life is out of our control. There's so many external factors to anything, right? You could follow my life journey, Dipti's life journey, anybody's life journey to the T, and you would not have the same outcomes because there's so many different factors. But what is in your control is the effort you put in, the intention, and your preparedness. Everything else is out of your control. So work on that. Work on what is in your control, because then when the right opportunity arises, you will be prepared to make the most of it.
Most wise words, I would say. Avanti, you're truly, truly, inspirational in that you have the clarity of purpose. You have meaning and you're looking for, to create impact in the world. I wish you all the best. You are at a very early age, of your life. And I hope you have many, many, many years to glow in the world and make your name and do some great work for the society as well. Thank you so much for speaking with us, and thank you for sharing such good advice.
Of course, thank you. And anybody watching or listening, please make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you can hear more wonderful conversations with Diptii. And truly, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Avanti. It was such a pleasure. That was Aditi Nagral for you, ladies and gentlemen. If you like the podcast, please share and subscribe. She has amazing words of wisdom for the youth and for artists in general. Thank you for watching. I truly appreciate your time.